Terminable and interminable analysis. Sigmund Freud. Terminable and interminable analysis. Experience has taught us that psychoanalytic therapy, the release of some of the neurotic symptoms, inhibitions, and character abnormalities, is a very time-consuming affair. For this reason, from the very beginning, attempts have been made to shorten the duration of the analysis. Such attempts do not require justification, and it is evident that they are based on imperative considerations of reason and expediency. But there was probably latent in them a transcript of the impatient curiosity with which medical science in the early days regarded neuroses, thinking that they were the consequence of invisible wounds. And if it was necessary to attend to them, it had to be done as quickly as possible. A particularly vigorous attempt in this direction was made by Otto Rank in his book The Trauma of Birth, 1924. This author supposed that the true source of the neuroses is the act of birth, since this carries with it the possibility that a primary fixation of the child towards the mother is not overcome and persists as a primary repression. Rank hoped that if this primary trauma was dealt with in a subsequent analysis, the neurosis might be fully resolved. Thus, this small part of the analytical work would save the need for the rest. And this could be done in a few months. Rank's argument was indisputably promising and ingenious, but it did not stand the test of critical scrutiny. Rather, it was a product of its time, conceived under the pressure of the contrast between the misery of post-war Europe and the prosperity of America, and designed to adapt the tempo of analytic therapy to the rush of American life. We haven't heard much about what Rank's innovation has accomplished in cases of illness. Probably no more than if a fire brigade, called to a house on fire as a result of the fall of an oil lamp, were content to remove the lamp from the room where the fire started. There is no doubt that by this means the activities of the fire brigade would have been considerably shortened. The theory and practice of Rank's experiment are things of the past, as is American prosperity itself. I had adopted another way of accelerating a psychoanalytic treatment already before the war. At that time I had taken charge of the case of a young Russian man, a man who had been spoiled by wealth and had arrived in Vienna in a state of complete collapse, accompanied by a doctor and a nurse. In the course of a few years it was possible to restore much of his independence, awaken his interest in life, and adjust his relationships with the people who mattered most to him. But then the improvement stopped. We could go no further in elucidating his childhood neurosis, on which his later illness had been based, and it was clear that the patient found his present position very comfortable and had no wish to go one step closer to it. At the end of your treatment, it was a case where the treatment inhibited itself. He was on the brink of failure as a result of his partial success. In this situation I resorted to the heroic procedure of setting a time limit for the analysis. At the beginning of the year's work I informed the patient that this would be the last of his treatment, whatever the result at the agreed time. At first he didn't believe me, but as soon as he was convinced that I was serious, the desired change appeared. His resistance subsided, and in the last few months he was able to reproduce all the memories and discover all the relationships that seemed necessary to understand his early neurosis and to master his current one. When she left me, in the summer of 1914, not suspecting, like the rest of us, what was to happen next, I believed that her cure was radical and permanent. In a note added to the clinical history of this patient in 1923, I already pointed out that I had been wrong. When he returned to Vienna as a refugee and destitute towards the end of the war, I had to help him master a part of the transfer that had not been resolved. This was accomplished in a few months, and I was able to complete my additional note by saying that since then the patient has felt normal and behaved inconspicuously, despite the fact that the war deprived him of his home, his possessions, and all his family and friends. 15 years have passed without denying the truth of this assertion, but certain reservations are necessary. The patient has remained in Vienna and has retained a place, albeit a humble one, in society. But during this period his state of good health has sometimes been interrupted by pathological episodes that could only be understood as emanations of his perennial neurosis. Thanks to the skill of one of my students, Dr. Ruth Mack Brunswick, a brief treatment has brought each of these alterations to a successful end. I hope Dr. McBrunswick will report back on the details. Some of these episodes were still associated with remnants of the transference, and when this occurred, although they were short, they were clearly paranoid in character. In other episodes, however, the pathogenic material consisted of fragments of the patient's childhood hysteria which had not surfaced when I was analyzing him and which were now expelled. The comparison is inevitable, like stitches after an operation or small fragments of a necrotic bone. It seems to me that the story of this patient's cure is at least as interesting as that of his illness. Subsequently, I have also used the setting of a time limit in other cases, and I have also taken into account the experience of other psychoanalysts. There can only be one verdict on the value of this blackmail: it is effective as long as it is done at the right time. But it cannot guarantee the complete fulfillment of the task. On the contrary, we can be sure that while part of the material will become accessible under the pressure of this threat, another part will remain stored and buried as it was before and lost to our therapeutic efforts. Because once the analyst has set the time limit, he cannot prolong it, otherwise the patient would lose faith in him. The clearest path for the patient would be to continue his treatment with another analyst, even though we know that this change will lead to a new waste of time and the abandonment of the results of work already done. Nor can a general rule be established as to the opportune moment in which this technical resource must be used. The decision must be left to the psychoanalyst's tact. A miscalculation cannot be rectified, and the saying that a lion only jumps once must apply here. Discussion of the technical problem of how to speed up the slow progress of a scan leads us to another, more deeply interesting question: is there such a thing as natural termination of a scan? Is there any possibility of taking an analysis to this end? If one judges by the current language of psychoanalysts, it would seem that this should be the case, for we often hear them say, when they deplore or excuse the admitted imperfections of some mortal, his analysis was not finished, or he was never analyzed until the end. First of all, we have to decide what is meant by the ambiguous phrase "the end of an analysis." From a practical point of view, it is easy to answer. An analysis is over when the psychoanalyst and the patient stop meeting for analysis sessions. This happens when two conditions have been fulfilled more or less completely: first, that the patient no longer suffers from his symptoms and has overcome his anxiety and inhibitions; second, that the analyst judges that so much repressed material has been made conscious, that so many things that were unintelligible have been explained, and so much internal resistance has been conquered, that there is no need to fear a repetition of the pathological processes in question. If external difficulties prevent the achievement of this goal, it is better to speak of an incomplete analysis than an unfinished analysis. The other meaning of completion of an analysis is much more ambitious. In this other sense, what we are asking is whether the analyst has had such an influence on the patient that no further changes could be expected in him even if the analysis continued. It is as if it were possible to obtain through psychoanalysis a level of absolute psychic normality, a level that we were confident would remain stable, as if we had managed to resolve each of the patient's repressions and fill in all the gaps in his memory. We must first consult our experience to find out if such things really happen, and then go back to our theory to find out if there is any possibility of this happening. Every analyst has treated a few cases that have had this satisfactory result. He has succeeded in eradicating neurotic disorders that have not reappeared or been replaced by any other. We do not stop having some knowledge about determinants of these results. The patient's self had not been visibly altered, and the etiology of his disorder was essentially traumatic. After all, the etiology of any neurotic disorder is mixed. Either it happens that the instincts are excessively intense, that is, they are recalcitrant to be tamed by the ego - or they are the result of premature traumas that the immature ego was unable to master. Usually there is a combination of both factors, the constitutional and the accidental. The more intense the constitutional factor, the more easily a trauma will lead to a fixation and leave behind a developmental disorder. The more intense the trauma, the more surely its deleterious effects will manifest themselves, even when the instinctive situation is normal. There is no doubt that a traumatic etiology offers a more favorable field for psychoanalysis. Only when a case is predominantly traumatic in origin will psychoanalysis be able to do what it is capable of doing in a superlative way. Only then, thanks to having strengthened the patient's ego, will he succeed in replacing the inappropriate decision made in the early days of his life with a correct solution. Only in such cases can one speak of an analysis being definitively terminated. In them, psychoanalysis has done everything it should and does not have to be continued. It is true that if the patient who has been cured never develops another disorder that requires psychoanalysis, we do not know to what extent his immunity is not due to a beneficent fate that has saved him from too serious torments. A constitutional intensity of the instinct and an unfavorable alteration of the ego acquired in the defensive struggle in the sense that it is dislocated and restricted, are factors detrimental to the effectiveness of an analysis and can make its duration interminable. We would be tempted to make the first factor, instinct intensity, responsible in turn for the emergence of the second, the alteration of the ego, but it seems that the latter also has its own etiology. And we really must admit that our knowledge of these matters is still insufficient. Only now do they become objects of psychoanalytic study. In this field, the interest of analysis seems to me to be misdirected. Instead of inquiring into how a cure is effected by psychoanalysis, a question which I think has already been sufficiently elucidated, the question should ask what are the obstacles that stand in the way of such a cure. This leads me to discuss two problems that flow directly from psychoanalytic practice, as I hope to demonstrate with the following examples. A man who had conducted a very successful self-analysis came to the conclusion that his relationships with men and women, with the men who were his competitors and with the women he loved, were not free of neurotic alterations, and as a consequence he underwent psychoanalysis by another person whom he considered superior to him. This self-critical illumination was completely successful. He married the woman he loved and became a friend and teacher to his supposed rivals. Many years passed in this way, during which his relations with his psychoanalyst remained cloudless. But then, for reasons not outwardly appreciable, conflicts arose. The man who had been psychoanalyzed became an antagonist to the analyst, and reproached him for not being able to give him a complete analysis. The analyst, according to him, should have known and taken into account the fact that a transference relationship can never be purely positive. I should have paid attention to the possibilities of a negative transfer. The psychoanalyst defended himself by saying that at the time of the analysis there were no signs of negative transference. But if he had not been able to discover some slight sign of it, which could not be ruled out, considering the limited horizon of psychoanalysis in that early period, it was doubtful, he thought, that he could have activated a topic, or, as we say, a complex, only mentioning it insofar as it was not active in the patient at that time. Certainly to activate it would have required some form of unpleasant behavior on the part of the analyst. In addition, he added, not every good relationship between an analyst and his patient during and after the analysis has to be considered as a transference, because there are also friendly relationships that are based on reality and that are viable. I now turn to my second example, which poses the same problem. A single woman, no longer young, had lived in isolation since puberty due to an inability to walk due to severe leg pain. Her condition was clearly hysterical in nature and had defied many types of treatment. A psychoanalysis that lasted 3/4 of a year made the disorder disappear and restored to the patient, an excellent and well-endowed person, her right to participate in life. In the years that followed her cure she was continually unlucky. There were disasters and financial losses in her family, and as she got older, she saw any hope of happiness based on love and marriage disappear. But the former invalid faced it all bravely and was a support to her family through difficult times. I cannot remember if it was 12 or 14 years after her analysis that, due to profuse bleeding, she had to undergo a gynecological examination. A fibroid was found that recommended the practice of a total hysterectomy. After the operation, the woman became ill again. She fell in love with the surgeon, indulged in masochistic fantasies about the terrible changes she had undergone within fantasies with which she concealed her affair and proved inaccessible to further attempts at psychoanalysis. It remained abnormal until the end of his life. Psychoanalytic treatment was carried out so long ago that we cannot expect much insight based on it. It was done in the early years of my work as a psychoanalyst. There is no doubt that the patient's second illness could have arisen from the same source as the first, which had been successfully treated. It may have been a different manifestation of the same repressed impulses that the analysis had only incompletely resolved. But I am inclined to think that, had it not been for the new trauma, a new outbreak of the neurosis would not have appeared. These two examples, which have been selected intentionally from a large number of similar ones, will suffice to start a discussion of the issues we are considering. The skeptic, the optimist and the ambitious will regard them very differently. The first will say that it has been proven that even a successful analytic treatment does not protect the patient, who has been cured at the time, from later falling ill with another neurosis, or really with a neurosis derived from the same instinctive root. That is, of a recurrence of his old disorder. Others will consider that this has not been proven. They will object that the two examples date from the earliest days of psychoanalysis, 20 and 30 years ago respectively, and that since then we have gained a deeper understanding and a broader knowledge and that our technique has changed in accordance with our new discoveries. Today, they will say, we can ask and hope that a psychoanalytic treatment will give permanent results, or at least that if a patient relapses, his new illness will not be a revival of his primitive instinctive disorder, which manifests itself in a new way. Our experience, they will maintain, does not compel us to so materially restrict the demands that can be made on our therapeutic method. My reason for choosing these two examples is, of course, precisely that they are so far apart in the past. It is clear that the more recent the successful result of an analysis, the less usable it is for our discussion, since we cannot predict what the history following restoration will be. The optimist's expectations clearly presuppose a number of things that are not exactly self-evident. They assume, in the first place, that there really is a possibility of resolving an instinctual conflict, or, more correctly, a conflict between the ego and an instinct, definitively and forever. Second, that while we are treating someone for an instinctual conflict, we can somehow immunize him against the possibility of any other such conflict, and thirdly, that we can, for prophylaxis purposes, resolve a pathogenic conflict of this kind which is not presently manifested by any indication and that it is advisable to do so. I present these problems without intending to answer them now. It may not be possible at present to give a sure answer to any of them. Some light can probably be shed on this by theoretical considerations. But another point is made clear: if we want to meet the highest demands with psychoanalytic therapy, our path will not lead to a shortening of its duration. A psychoanalytic experience that now spans a few decades and a change in the nature and mode of my activity encourage me to try to answer the questions that arise. In the early days I treated a large number of patients, who naturally wanted to be cured as quickly as possible. In recent years I have dedicated myself, above all, to didactic analysis. A relatively small number of severe cases continued with me for continued treatment, interrupted, however, for more or less long intervals. In them the therapeutic goal was no longer the same. It was not about shortening the treatment, the purpose was to radically exhaust the possibilities of disease and reveal a profound alteration of his personality. Of the three factors that we have recognized as decisive for the success of psychoanalytic treatment, the influence of traumas, the constitutional intensity of the instincts and the alterations of the ego, the one that concerns us here is only the second, the strength of the instincts. A moment's reflection raises the question of whether the restrictive use of the adjective constitutional, or congenital, is essential. However true it may be that the constitutional factor is of decisive importance from the start, it can be conceived, without. However, a reinforcement of instinct late in life may produce the same effects. If so, we would have to modify our formula and say the Instinct intensity at the moment instead of instinct constitutional strength. The first of our questions was, is it possible to resolve, through psychoanalytic therapy, a conflict between an instinct and the ego, or one caused by a pathogenic instinctual demand on the ego, in a permanent and definitive way? In order to avoid misunderstandings, it is perhaps not unnecessary to explain more exactly what we mean by resolving an instinctual demand permanently. Certainly not to make the lawsuit disappear so that nothing is ever heard of it again. This is, in general, impossible, and it is also not at all desirable. By this we mean something completely different, something that can be roughly described as a domestication of instinct. That is, the instinct is integrated into the harmony of the ego, becomes accessible to all the influences of the other drives on the ego, and no longer tries to follow its independent path to satisfaction. If we are asked by what methods and means this result is achieved, it is not easy to find an answer. We can only say, so must den doch die Hexe dran, the metapsychology of witches. Without metaphysical speculation and certain theorizing, I would almost say fantasies, we will not take another step forward. Unfortunately, here, as elsewhere, what our witch reveals to us is neither very clear nor very detailed. We have only one clue to begin with, although it is a clue of the greatest value — the antithesis between primary and secondary processes, and at this point I shall limit myself to pointing out this antithesis. If we now return to our first question, we find that our new approach leads inevitably to a peculiar conclusion. The question was whether it is possible to resolve an instinctual conflict in a permanent and definitive way, that is, to master an instinctual demand in this way. Formulated in these terms, the question makes no mention of the intensity of the instinct, but it is precisely on this that the result depends. Let us start from the assumption that what analysis achieves in neurotics is no more than what normal people accomplish for themselves without help. However, daily experience teaches us that in a normal person any solution to an instinctual conflict is only good for a particular intensity of the instinct, or rather only for a certain relationship between the intensity of the instinct and the strength of the ego. If this diminishes, be it through illness or fatigue or some other similar cause, all the instincts that have hitherto been successfully subdued may renew their demands and tend to obtain substitute satisfactions in abnormal ways. The irrefutable proof of this statement is provided by our nocturnal dreams. They react to the attitude assumed by the ego during sleep with an awakening of instinctual demands. The other portion of the material, the force of the instincts, is equally evident. Twice in the course of individual development certain instincts are considerably reinforced, at puberty, and in women, at menopause. We are not at all surprised that a person who has not been neurotic before becomes such at such times. When her instincts were not so strong, she managed to control them, but when they are reinforced, it fails to do so. The repression acts like the dikes against the push of the water. The same effects produced by these two physiological reinforcements of the instinct can appear irregularly from accidental causes in any other period of life. These reinforcements can be presented by recent traumas, forced frustrations, or by the collateral influence of some instincts on others. The result is always the same and underlines the irresistible power of the quantitative factor in the origin of the disease. I think you should be ashamed of such a lengthy exposition, considering that everything I have said has long been known and self-evident. Really, we have always behaved as if we knew all this, but, in general, our theoretical concepts have neglected to give the same importance to the economic approach as to dynamic and topographical attitudes. So my excuse is that I am calling attention to this oversight. Before settling on an answer to this question, we must consider an objection whose force lies in the fact that we are probably biased in its favor. Our arguments, it will be said, are all deduced from the processes that take place spontaneously between the ego and the instincts and presuppose that psychoanalytic therapy can achieve nothing that, under favorable and normal conditions, does not occur by itself. But is this really so? Does not our theory precisely proclaim that analysis produces a state that never occurs spontaneously in the ego, and that this newly created state constitutes the essential difference between a person who has been psychoanalyzed and another who has not? Let's think about what this statement is based on. All repressions take place in early childhood. They are primitive defensive measures taken by the immature and weak self. In later years no new repressions appear, but the old ones persist and the ego continues to use them to tame the instincts. New conflicts are resolved by what we call later repression. We can apply to these infantile repressions our general statement that the repression depends absolutely and entirely on the relative intensity of the forces involved, and that it cannot be maintained when the intensity of the instincts increases. However, psychoanalysis allows the self that has reached greater maturity and strength to undertake a revision of those old repressions. A few are destroyed, while others are recognized, but rebuilt with more solid material. These new dikes are of a very different degree of firmness from the former. We can trust that they will not give in so easily to an increase in the force of instincts. Thus, the true result of psychoanalytic therapy would be the subsequent correction of the primitive process of repression, a correction that puts an end to the dominance of the quantitative factor. Up to here, then, our theory, which we cannot renounce except under an irresistible compulsion. And what does our experience have to say about this? Perhaps it is not yet wide enough for us to reach a definitive conclusion. It confirms our expectations quite often, but not always. We feel that we should not be surprised if in the end we find that the difference between the behavior of one person who has not been psychoanalyzed and that of another after it is not as complete as we try to make it, nor as we expect it to be and as we claim it has been. Of being. If this is so, it would mean that analysis sometimes manages to eliminate the influence of increased instinct, but not invariably, or that the effect of psychoanalysis is limited to increasing the resisting power of inhibition so as to balance much greater demands than before the analysis, or if the analysis had not taken place. I really can't make a decision at this point, and I don't know if it's possible at the moment. There is, however, another angle from which we can approach the problem of the variability of the effects of psychoanalysis. We know that the first step to gain intellectual mastery of our surroundings is to discover the generalizations, rules, and laws that bring order out of chaos. By doing this we simplify the world of phenomena, but we cannot avoid falsifying it, especially if we deal with processes of development and change. What interests us is to discern a qualitative alteration, and usually in doing so we neglect, at least in the beginning, a quantitative factor. In the real world, transitions and intermediate stages are much more common than the opposite, clearly differentiated states. In studying developments and changes we direct our attention solely to the result. We easily overlook the fact that such processes are usually more or less incomplete, that is, that they are really only partial alterations. A witty satirist from Old Austria, Johann Nestroy, once said, "Every step forward is only half as long as it first appears." It is tempting to attribute general validity to this malicious phrase. Residual phenomena almost always remain, a partial sequel. When a generous patron surprises us by some isolated trait of meanness, or when a person who is always very nice suddenly takes hostile action, these residual phenomena are of great value to genetic research. They show us that these praiseworthy and precious qualities are based on compensation and overcompensation, which has not been the absolute and complete success that we had hoped for. Our first idea of the evolution of the libido was that a primitive oral phase gave way to another sadistic anal phase, and that this in turn was followed by a phallic genital phase. Subsequent research has not contradicted these views, but has corrected them by adding that these replacements do not take place suddenly, but gradually, so that fragments of the old organization always persist alongside the newer, and even in normal evolution the transformation is never complete, and in the final configuration residues of previous libidinal fixations may still persist. The same is seen in completely different fields. Of all the erroneous and superstitious beliefs of humanity, which are supposed to have been superseded, there is none whose residue is not found among us today in the lowest strata of civilized peoples or in the upper layers of educated society. What once has come to be alive clings tenaciously to maintain existence. Sometimes we are inclined to doubt whether the dragons of prehistoric times are really extinct. Applying these observations to our present problem, I think that the answer to the question of how to explain the variable results of our psychoanalytic therapy could be that when we try to replace repressions, which are insecure, with ego-syntonic controls, we do not always achieve our aspirations in its fullness. That is, we did not achieve it completely. We have obtained the transformation, but often only partially. Fragments of the old mechanisms remain unaltered by the analytical work. It is difficult to prove that this is actually the case, because we have no other way of judging what happens than the result we are trying to explain. However, the impressions obtained during analytical work do not contradict this assumption, rather they seem to confirm it. But we must not take the clarity of our understanding as a measure of the conviction we produce in the patient. We could say that his conviction may lack depth, that is, it always depends on the quantitative factor, which is so easily overlooked. If this is the correct answer to our question, we can say that psychoanalysis, in claiming to cure neuroses by gaining control over instinct, is always right in theory, but not always in practice. And this because not in all cases it manages to secure to a sufficient degree the basis on which the control of an instinct is based. The cause of this partial failure is easily discovered. In the past, the quantitative factor of instinctual force was opposed to the defensive efforts of the ego. For this reason we have called on psychoanalysis to help us, and now that same factor places a limit on the effectiveness of this new effort. If the force of instinct is excessive, the mature ego, aided by analysis, fails in its task in the same way that the defenseless ego failed before. His control over instinct has improved, but it is still imperfect, because the transformation of the defensive mechanism is only incomplete. There is nothing surprising in this, since the power of the instruments with which psychoanalysis operates is not unlimited, but rather restricted, and the final eruption always depends on the relative strength of the psychic agents that fight among themselves. There is no doubt that shortening the duration of psychoanalytic treatment is desirable, but we can only achieve our therapeutic purpose by increasing the power of analysis so that it comes to help the ego. Hypnosis seemed to be an excellent instrument for these purposes, but the reasons that led us to abandon it are well known. And no replacement for it has yet been found. From this point of view we can understand how a master of psychoanalysis like Ferenczi dedicated the last years of his life to therapeutic experiences that, unfortunately, turned out to be in vain. The other two questions, whether while we are treating an instinctual conflict we can protect a patient from future conflicts and whether it is feasible and easy for prophylactic purposes to investigate a conflict that is not manifest at the moment, must be treated together, because obviously the first task can only be carried out while the second is carried out, that is, as soon as a possible future conflict is converted into a current conflict that can be influenced. This new way of presenting the problem is, basically, only an extension of the first. While in the first example we considered how to protect against the recurrence of the same conflict, we now consider how to protect against its possible substitution by another conflict. This seems like a very ambitious goal, but all we want to do is show what limits exist to the effectiveness of psychoanalytic therapy. Even when our therapeutic ambition is tempted to undertake such tasks, experience rejects the possibility of doing so. If an instinctual conflict is not currently active, does not manifest itself, we cannot influence it even with psychoanalysis. The advice that we should leave sleeping dogs alone, which we have heard so many times in connection with our efforts to explore the deep psychic world, is particularly inappropriate if applied to psychic life. Because if the instincts are producing disorders, this is the proof that dogs do not sleep, and if they really seem to be sleeping, it is not in our power to wake them. However, this last statement does not appear to be entirely accurate and requires further discussion. Let us consider the means at our disposal to transform an instinctual conflict that is for the moment latent into one that is currently active. Obviously, we can only do two things. We can produce situations in which the conflict becomes active, or we can content ourselves with discussing it in the analysis and pointing out the possibility of its arising. The first of these two alternatives can be carried out in two ways, in reality or in transference, in either case exposing the patient to a certain amount of real suffering through frustration and the repressing of the libido. It is true that we already use a technique of this kind in our ordinary analytical method. What else does the rule mean that the analysis must be carried out in a state of frustration? But it is a technique that we use to deal with the currently active conflict. We try to bring that conflict to a culmination, to develop it to the maximum in order to feed the instinctive force that can be available for its solution. Psychoanalytic experience has taught us that the best is always the enemy of the good, and that in each phase of the patient's recovery we have to fight against his inertia, which immediately settles for an incomplete solution. If, however, what we seek is a prophylactic treatment of instinctual conflicts that are not actually active, but merely potential, it will not be enough to regulate the sufferings that are already present in the patient and that he cannot avoid. We should be willing to cause him new suffering, and this until now, and with full reason, we have left it in the hands of fate. On all sides we would be reproached for trying to substitute for fate if we subjected poor human creatures to these cruel experiments. And what kind of experiments would they be? For prophylaxis purposes. Could we take responsibility for destroying a satisfying marriage or counseling the patient to leave a job on which his livelihood depends? Fortunately, we are never in a situation of having to consider whether such interventions in the patient's real life are justified. We do not possess the full powers that would be necessary, and the subject of our therapeutic experiment would surely refuse to cooperate in it. So in practice such a procedure is virtually excluded, but, in addition, there are theoretical objections. For the work of analysis progresses best if the patient's pathogenic experiences belong to the past, so that his ego can be at a certain distance from them. In acute crisis states psychoanalysis cannot be used for any purpose. All the interest of the ego is absorbed by the painful reality and withdraws from analysis, which is an attempt to penetrate below the surface and discover the influences of the past. To create a new conflict would only make psychoanalytic work longer and more difficult. We will be told that these observations are completely unnecessary. No one thinks of conjuring up new situations of suffering on purpose to make it possible to treat a latent instinctual conflict. This could not be too much boasted of as a prophylactic achievement. We know, for example, that a patient who has been cured of scarlet fever is immune to a relapse of the same disease, but it never occurs to any doctor to take a person who can get scarlet fever and infect him with that disease to immunize against it. The protective measure must not produce the same dangerous situation that the disease itself creates, but only something much milder, as in the case of vaccination against smallpox and many other similar procedures. In psychoanalytic prophylaxis, therefore, against instinctual conflicts the only methods that can be considered are the other two that we have mentioned, the artificial production of new conflicts in the transference, conflicts which, after all, lack the character of reality, and the presentation of real conflicts in the patient's imagination by telling him about them and familiarizing him with their possibility. I don't know if we can affirm that the first of these softer procedures is excluded from psychoanalysis. In this direction no special experiments have been made. But the difficulties that arise do not cast a very promising light on such undertakings. Firstly, the chances of such a situation in the transfer are very limited. Patients cannot themselves bring all their conflicts to the transference, nor can the psychoanalyst elicit all their possible instinctual conflicts from the transference situation. It may provoke their jealousy or cause them to experience disappointment in love, but a technical purpose is not required to bring about this. These things happen by themselves in most analyses. Secondly, we must not overlook the fact that all measures of this kind would force the psychoanalyst to behave in an unfriendly way with the patients, and this would have a disturbing effect on the affective attitude, on the positive transference, which it is the strongest motive for the patient to participate in the common work of psychoanalysis. Thus, we should not expect much from this procedure. This leaves only one method open to us, the one which was probably the only one originally considered. We talk to the patient about the possibilities of other instinctual conflicts and raise the expectation that such conflicts may appear in him. Our hope is that this information and this warning will have the effect of activating one of the conflicts we have indicated to a moderate degree and yet sufficient for treatment. But this time the experience speaks with a clear voice. The expected result does not appear. The patient hears our message, but the resonance is missing. You may think, this is very interesting, but I don't feel the slightest trace of it. We have increased its knowledge, but we have not altered anything in it. The situation is the same as when people read psychoanalytic works. The reader is stimulated only by those passages which he feels apply to himself, that is, they concern conflicts that are active in him at that moment. Everything else leaves him cold. We can have analogous experiences, I think, when we give children a sexual clarification. I am far from holding that this is harmful or unnecessary, but it is clear that the prophylactic effect of this liberal measure has been greatly overestimated. After this clarification, the children know something that they did not know before, but they do not use the new knowledge that has been provided to them. We even come to see that they are in no hurry to sacrifice to this new knowledge the sexual theories, which could be described as a natural growth, and which they themselves have built in harmony and dependence with their imperfect libidinal organization, theories about the role played by the stork, regarding the nature of sexual contact and how children are made. Long after having received the sexual clarification, they behave just like the primitive races that have received the influence of Christianity, but they continue to secretly worship their old idols. We had started from the question of how we can shorten the uncomfortable duration of psychoanalytic treatment, and keeping in mind this question of time, we have come to consider whether it is possible to achieve a permanent cure and even prevent future illnesses by prophylactic treatment. In doing this, we found that the decisive factors for the success of our therapeutic efforts were the influence of a traumatic etiology, the relative strength of the instincts to be controlled, and a thing we have called an ego disturbance. Only the second of these factors has been discussed in any detail, and in connection with it we have had occasion to recognize the enormous importance of the quantitative factor and to emphasize the claim of the metapsychological approach to be taken into account in any attempt at explanation. Regarding the third factor, the alteration of the self, we have not said anything yet. If we turn our attention to it, the first impression we receive is that there is much to ask and much to answer, and that what we say about it would be very uncertain. This first impression is confirmed when we delve deeper into the problem. As is well known, the analytic situation is that we ally ourselves with the ego of the person undergoing treatment in order to control parts of his ID that are uncontrolled, that is, to include them in the synthesis of his self. The fact that cooperation of this kind usually fails in the case of psychotics allows us to establish our feet solidly for judgment. If we are to be able to make a pact with the self, it must be normal. But a normal self of this kind is, like normality in general, an ideal fiction. The abnormal self, which does not serve our purposes, is unfortunately not a fiction. Every normal person is in fact normal only insofar as he belongs to the average. His ego approximates that of the psychotic in one or another aspect and in a greater or lesser quantity, and the degree of their departure from one end of the series and their proximity to the other will provide us with a provisional measure of what we have so imprecisely called ego disturbance. If we ask what is the source of the great diversity of kinds and degrees of ego disturbance, we cannot escape the first obvious alternative that these disturbances are either congenital or acquired. Of these, the second class will be the easiest to deal with. If they are certainly acquired, they will have been so in the course of development, beginning already in the first years of life. For the ego must try, from the beginning, to carry out its task of mediating between its ID and the external world in the service of the pleasure principle and protecting the ID from the dangers of the external world. If in the course of these efforts the ego also learns to adopt a defensive attitude towards its own ID and to treat the instinctual demands of the latter as external dangers, this happens, at least in part, because it realizes that the satisfaction of the instinct would lead to conflicts with the world. External. Therefore, under the influence of education, the ego becomes accustomed to taking the scene of the struggle from the outside in and to master the internal danger before it becomes an external danger, and probably most of the time it is right to do so. During this struggle on two fronts, later there will be a third front as well. The ego uses various procedures to carry out its task, which is, to put it in general terms, to avoid danger, anxiety, and unpleasure. We call these procedures defense mechanisms. Our knowledge about them is not yet complete. Anna Freud's book, 1936, has given us a first glimpse of its multiplicity and its polyvalent meaning. It was from one of these mechanisms of repression that the study of neurotic processes had its beginning. There was never any doubt that it was not the only procedure that the self could employ for its purposes. But repression is a very peculiar thing and is now more clearly differentiated from the other mechanisms than they are from each other. I would like to make this relation to the other mechanisms clear by means of an analogy, although I know that in these matters analogies cannot get us very far. Imagine what might have happened to a book in a time when books were not printed, but were written individually. We will assume that one of these books contains statements that in later times were considered undesirable. For example, according to Robert Eisler, 1929, the writings of Flavius Josephus would have contained passages about Jesus Christ that would be offensive to later Christianity. Currently, the only defensive mechanism that official censorship could use would be to confiscate and destroy all copies of the edition. Different methods were used at that time to render the book innocuous. One was to conscientiously cross out the offending passages so that they would be illegible. Then they could not be transcribed and the later copyist produced an irreproachable text, but with gaps in certain passages and, therefore, these could be unintelligible. Another way, if the authorities were not satisfied with it and wanted it not to be perceived that the text had been mutilated, was to proceed with its distortion. Some words could be omitted or replaced by others, and some new phrases, interspersed. Better than nothing, the entire passage would be erased and another one saying the exact opposite would be put in its place. The next copyist would produce a text that would not arouse suspicion, but would be forged. It would no longer contain what the author wanted to say, and it is very probable that the corrections would not have been made based on the truth. If we do not follow the analogy too rigidly, we can say that repression has the same relation to the other methods of defense that omission has to the distortion of the text, and in the different forms of this falsification we can discover parallels with the diversity of modes in those in which the self is altered. One can try to raise the objection that the analogy is wrong on an essential point, because the distortion of a text is the work of a tendentious censorship of which it finds nothing similar in the evolution of the self. But this is not so because a tendentious purpose of this kind is amply represented by the driving force of the pleasure principle. The psychic apparatus does not tolerate displeasure, it must be eliminated at all costs, and if the perception of reality brings displeasure with it, that perception, this is the truth, must be sacrificed. Where there are external dangers, the individual can help himself for some time by running away and avoiding dangerous situations until later he is strong enough to displace the threat by actively altering reality. But we cannot run away from ourselves. Flight is not a remedy against internal danger. And for this reason the defensive mechanisms of the ego are doomed to falsify our internal perception and give us only an imperfect and distorted image of our ID. Thus, in its relationship with the ID, the ego is paralyzed by its restrictions or blinded by its errors, and the result of this in the sphere of psychic events can only be compared to wandering through unknown territory, and without having a good pair of legs. Defense mechanisms serve the purpose of warding off dangers. That in this they succeed cannot be denied, and it is doubtful whether the ego could do without them during its development. But it is also true that, in turn, they can become dangers. Sometimes it turns out that the self has paid too high a price for the services rendered to it. The dynamic expenditure necessary to maintain them and the ego restrictions that they presuppose almost invariably place a heavy burden on the psychic economy. Furthermore, these mechanisms do not die out after having helped the ego through the difficult years of its development. Naturally, no individual uses all possible defense mechanisms. Each person only uses a selection of them. But these remain fixed in their self. They become regular modes of reaction of his character, which are repeated throughout his life when a situation similar to the original one occurs. This turns them into infantilisms, which share the fate of so many institutions that try to survive after the time when they were useful has passed. Vernunfeed word unsin, woltat plage, the poet complains. The adult ego, with its increased strength, continues to defend itself against dangers that no longer exist in reality. He feels impelled to search in reality for those situations which can serve as a rough substitute for primitive danger in order to justify, in relation to them, his maintaining his habitual modes of reaction. Thus we can easily understand how defensive mechanisms, producing a broader alienation from the outside world and a permanent weakening of the ego, facilitate and pave the way for the eruption of neurosis. But at the moment we are not interested in the pathogenic role of defense mechanisms. What we are trying to discover is the influence that the ego disturbances, which correspond to them, have on our therapeutic efforts. The material for an answer to this question appears in the book by Anna Freud to which we have already referred. The essential point is that the patient repeats these modes of reaction during the analytic work, that he produces them before our eyes. Actually, only by this way can we know them. This does not mean that they make psychoanalysis impossible. On the contrary, they constitute half of our analytical task. The other half, which was what psychoanalysis was concerned with in its early days, is the discovery of what is hidden in the ID. During treatment our therapeutic work is continually swinging back and forth, like a pendulum, between one bit of ID analysis and another bit of ego analysis. In the first case we need to make something of the ID conscious, in the other we want to correct something of the self. The important thing is that the defensive mechanisms directed against the primitive danger reappear in the treatment as resistances against the cure. From this it follows that the ego regards healing as a new danger. The therapeutic effect depends on what is repressed, in the broadest sense of the word, in the ID becoming conscious. We prepare the way for this awareness by interpretations and constructions, but we interpret only for ourselves and not for the patient, while the ego clings to its old defenses and does not abandon its resistances. Now these resistances, although they belong to the ego, are unconscious and in a way isolated within it. The psychoanalyst recognizes them more easily than the hidden material in the ID. One might think that it would be enough to treat them as fragments of the ID and, making them conscious, put them in relation to the rest of the ego. In this way we would suppose that we had accomplished half the task of psychoanalysis. We should not count on meeting resistance against the discovery of resistances. But this is what happens. During the work on resistances, the ego withdraws more or less seriously from the agreement on which the psychoanalytic situation is based. The ego ceases to support our efforts to discover the ID, it opposes them, disobeys the fundamental rule of analysis and does not allow anything derived from what is repressed to emerge. We cannot expect the patient to have a strong conviction about the curative power of the analysis. It may have brought with it a certain degree of trust in the analyst, which will be reinforced until it becomes effective by the positive transference factors that will be created in him. Under the influence of the unpleasant impulses that he feels as a result of the reactivation of his defensive conflicts, the negative transferences can come to the fore and completely nullify the psychoanalytic situation. Now the patient looks at the psychoanalyst as a stranger who has unpleasant demands on him and then behaves like a child who does not like the stranger and does not believe anything he says. If the psychoanalyst tries to explain to the patient one of the distortions made by him for defense purposes and to correct him, he finds him without understanding and inaccessible to the best founded arguments. Thus we see that there is a resistance to the discovery of resistances, and the defensive mechanisms really deserve the name we originally gave them even before having examined them in detail. They are resistances not only to the awareness of the contents of the ID, but also to analysis as a whole and, therefore, to healing. The effect on the self of the defenses can aptly be described as self-alteration, if by this we mean a departure from the fiction of a normal self that would warrant unwavering loyalty to the work of analysis. It is then easy to accept the fact, which daily experience shows, that the result of a psychoanalytic treatment essentially depends on the strength and depth of the roots of those resistances, which give rise to an alteration of the self. Again we are faced with the importance of the quantitative factor, and again we have to think that the analysis can only make use of defined and limited quantities of energy that have to be measured against the hostile forces. And it seems as if victory was in fact found, as a general rule, on the side of the big battalions. The next question to be addressed is whether all ego disturbances, in our sense of the term, are acquired during the defensive struggles of the early years. There is no doubt as to the answer. We have no reason to deny the existence and importance of original and innate distinctive characteristics of the self. This is verified by the simple fact that each person makes a selection of possible defense mechanisms, using only a few and always the same ones. This would seem to indicate that each ego is endowed from the beginning with individual dispositions and impulses, although it is true that we cannot specify their nature or what determines them. We also know that we should not exaggerate the difference between inherited and acquired characters as an antithesis. What was acquired by our ancestors certainly forms an important part of what we inherit. When we speak of an archaic inheritance, we are usually thinking only of the ID and seem to accept that at the beginning of individual life there is not yet an ego. But we must not overlook the fact that the ID and the ego are originally the same thing, nor does it imply a mystical overestimation of heredity to think that it is credible that even before the ego has come into existence, the lines of development, impulses, and reactions that it will later exhibit are already prepared for it. The psychological peculiarities of families, races, and nations, even in their attitude toward psychoanalysis, allow no other explanation. Even more, the psychoanalytic experience has imbued us with the conviction that even particular psychic contents, such as symbolism, have no other sources than hereditary transmission, and some research in the field of social anthropology makes it plausible to suppose that other precipitates, equally specialized, left by human evolution are also present in the archaic heritage. With the recognition that the properties of the ego that we encounter in the form of resistances can be both determined by heredity and acquired in defensive struggles, the topographical distinction between what is ego and what is ID loses much of its value for our investigation. If we go one step further in our analytic experience, we arrive at resistances of another type, which we can no longer locate and which seem to depend on fundamental conditions of the psychic apparatus. I can only give a few examples of this type of resistance. The field of research is still amazingly foreign to us and insufficiently explored. We find people, for example, to whom we would be inclined to attribute a special adhesiveness of the libido. The processes that the treatment sets in motion are much slower in them than in other people, because apparently they cannot get used to separating the cathexis from the Greek kathexis. In psychoanalysis, the concentration of desires on some object and idea, also the quantity of thus concentrated libidinal desires for one object in order to transfer them to another, although we cannot discover a special reason for this loyalty of the cathexis. We also find the opposite type of person, in which the libido seems particularly mobile. He easily enters into the new cathexis suggested by the analysis, abandoning the old ones. The difference between the two types is comparable to what a sculptor would feel depending on whether he worked on hard stone or on soft plaster. Unfortunately, in this second type the results of the analysis often turn out to be very short-lived. The new cathexis are soon abandoned, and we have the impression not of having worked in plaster, but of having written in water. In the words of the proverb, the sacristan's money comes singing and goes singing. In another group of cases we are surprised by an attitude of our patients that can only be attributed to an exhaustion of plasticity, of the capacity for change and development that we would ordinarily expect. We are indeed prepared to find in the analysis a certain degree of psychic inertia. When analytic work has opened up new paths for an instinctual impulse, we almost invariably find that the impulse does not enter them without marked hesitation. We have called this behavior, perhaps not quite correctly, ID resistance. But in the patients to whom I now refer, all mental processes, relationships, and distributions of forces are unchangeable, fixed, and rigid. We find the same thing in very old people, in which case it is explained as being due to what is described as force of habit or a depletion of receptivity, a kind of psychic entropy. But here we deal with people who are still young. Our theoretical knowledge does not seem adequate to give a correct explanation of these types. Probably some passing characteristics are involved, some disturbances in the rhythm of the development of mental life that we have not yet appreciated. In another group of cases, the distinctive characteristics of the ego, which are to be held accountable as sources of resistance to psychoanalytic treatment and as impediments to therapeutic success, may arise from deeper and different roots. Here we are dealing with the ultimate things, from which psychological research can learn something: the behavior of the two primal instincts, their distribution, their mixing, and their diffusion, things that cannot be thought of as being confined to a single province of the mind. Psychic apparatus, the ID, the ego, or the superego. During analytic work one gets no other impression of resistance than that it is a force that defends itself with all possible means against healing, and that it is completely resolved to cling to illness and suffering. A part of this force has been recognized by us, no doubt with justice, as the feeling of guilt and the need for punishment, and we have located it in the relation of the ego to the superego. But this is only the portion that is in some way psychically linked to the superego, thus making itself recognizable. Other portions of this same force, bound or free, may act in other unspecified places. If we consider the complete picture constituted by the phenomena of masochism, imminent in so many people, the negative therapeutic reaction and the feeling of guilt found in so many neurotics, we can no longer adhere to the belief that psychic events are governed exclusively by desire. Pleasure. These phenomena are unmistakable indications of the presence in the psychic life of a force that we call the aggressive or destructive instinct, depending on its purpose, and which we trace back to the primitive death instinct of living matter. This is not an antithesis between an optimistic and a pessimistic theory of life. Only by the mutually concurrent or opposite action of the two primal instincts, eros and the death instinct, and never by a single one of them, can we explain the rich multiplicity of the phenomena of life. How some parts of these two classes of instincts combine to carry out the various vital functions, under what conditions these combinations are loosened or broken, to what disturbances do these changes correspond, and with what feelings does the perceptual scale of the pleasure principle respond to them, they are problems whose elucidation would be the most interesting result of psychological investigation. For the moment we have to surrender to the superiority of the forces against which we see that our efforts are nullified. Even exercising a psychic influence in simple masochism is a burden on our possibilities. In studying the phenomena that testify to the activity of the destructive instinct, we are not confined to making observations on pathological material. Many facts of normal psychic life call for an explanation of this kind, and the sharper our gaze becomes, the more frequently we find them. The subject is too new and too important for me to treat it as a side issue here. I will content myself, therefore, with selecting a few examples. This is one. We already know that in all ages there have been, as there are now, people who can take members of their own sex as well as members of the opposite sex as sexual objects, without one impulse interfering with the other. We call these people bisexual and accept their existence without much surprise. We have also come to know that every human being is bisexual in this sense, and that his libido is distributed, manifestly or latently, over objects of both sexes. But the following surprises us: while in the first class of people the two impulses run together without conflict, in the second and more numerous they are in a state of irreconcilable conflict. The heterosexuality of a man is not understood with homosexuality, and vice versa. If the first is the strongest, it manages to keep the second latent, preventing its satisfaction in reality. On the other hand, there is no greater danger to a man's heterosexual function than that it be disturbed by his latent homosexuality. We could try to explain this by saying that each individual only has a certain amount of libido for which both rival drives have to fight. But it is not clear why rivals do not always divide the available amount of libido among themselves according to their relative strength, since they are able to do so in a number of cases. We are forced to accept the conclusion that the tendency to conflict is something special, something added to the situation, regardless of the amount of libido. An independently emerging tendency to present conflicts of this kind cannot really be attributed to anything but the intervention of an element of free aggressiveness. If we recognize the case we are discussing as an expression of the aggressive or destructive instinct, the question arises whether this opinion should not be extended to other kinds of conflicts, and even whether everything we know about psychic conflicts should not be revised from this new point of view. Angle. After all, we assume that in the course of man's development from a primitive to a civilized state his aggressiveness undergoes a considerable degree of internalization or turning inwards. If so, their internal conflicts would actually be the equivalent of the external struggles which have then ceased. I am already aware that the dualist theory, according to which an instinct for death or destruction or aggression claims the same rights as the eros that manifests itself in the libido, has met with little sympathy and has not really been accepted, not even by many. The psychoanalysts. This is why I was so pleased when, not long ago, I found this theory of mine in the writings of one of the great thinkers of ancient Greece. I am prepared to abandon the prestige of originality in favor of this confirmation, especially. For I cannot be sure, in view of the extent of my reading in the early years, whether what I believed to be a new creation was nothing more than an effect of cryptomnesia. Empedocles of Akragas, Girgenti, born around the year 495 BC. J.C. is one of the greatest and most notable figures in the history of Greek civilization. The activities of his multifaceted personality followed the most varied directions. He was a researcher and thinker, a prophet and a magician, a politician, a philanthropist and a doctor, with a good knowledge of the natural sciences. It was said of him that he had rid the city of Selinunt of malaria and was revered by his contemporaries as a god. His mind seems to have assembled the most abrupt contrasts. He was exact and sober in his physical and physiological investigations, although he did not escape the darkness of mysticism and built cosmic speculations of surprising imaginative acuity. Capel compares him to Dr. Faustus, to whom many secrets were revealed. Born at a time when the realm of science was divided into so many provinces, some of his theories must inevitably seem primitive to us. He explained the variety of things by the mixture of the four elements, earth, air, fire, and water. He maintained that all of nature was animated and believed in the transmigration of souls. But he also included in his theoretical body of knowledge such modern ideas as the gradual evaluation of living creatures, the survival of the fittest, and a recognition of the part played by luck, touch, in that evolution. But the theory of Empedocles that especially deserves our interest is one that comes so close to the psychoanalytic theory of the instincts that we would be tempted to maintain that the two are identical were it not for the difference that the Greek philosophers is a cosmic fantasy, while ours is content to claim biological validity. At the same time, the fact that Empedocles ascribes to the universe the same animated nature as to the individual organism deprives this difference of much of its importance. The philosopher taught that two principles governed events in the life of the universe and in the life of the mind, and that these principles were continually at war with each other. He called them Gilia, love, and Nikos, struggle. Of these two forces, which he basically conceived as natural forces operating as instincts and in no way intelligences with a conscious purpose, the one tends to agglomerate the primary particles of the four elements into a single unit, while the other another, on the contrary, seeks to dissolve all these fusions and separate the primitive particles from the elements. Empedocles thought that the process of the universe was a continuous and incessant alternation of periods, in which one or the other of the two fundamental forces obtained the superiority, so that sometimes love, sometimes struggle, fully achieve their purposes and dominate the universe, after which the opponent, previously defeated, prevails and, in turn, defeats its opponent. The two fundamental principles of Empedocles' and Nikos are as regards man and function, the same as our two primal instincts, eros and the tendency to destruction, the first of which is aimed at combining what exists in units increasing, while the second aspires to dissolve these combinations and to destroy the structures to which they have given rise. We will not be surprised, however, find that in its re-emergence after 2.5 millennia this theory has been altered in some of its aspects. Apart from the restriction to the biophysical field that has been imposed on us, we no longer have the four elements of Empedocles as basic substances. What lives has been clearly differentiated from what is inanimate, and we no longer think of the mixing and separation of particles of substance, but of the welding and dissolution of instinctive components. In addition, we have provided a kind of biological basis for the struggle principle, tracing our destruction instinct to the death instinct, the desire of the living to return to an inanimate state. This is not to deny that a similar instinct existed before, nor, of course, to affirm that an instinct of this kind only appeared with the emergence of life. And no one can foresee in what way the kernel of truth contained in Empedocles' theory will present itself to the comprehension of posterity. In 1927 Ferenczi read an instructive article on the problem of completion of analyses. It ends with a comforting statement that analysis is not an endless process, but can be brought to a natural completion with sufficient skill and patience on the part of the analyst. However, the joint work seems to me to contain a warning not to aspire to shorten psychoanalysis, but to deepen it. Ferenczi points out that success depends very largely on whether the analyst has learned enough from his own mistakes and has corrected the errors. Weak points of your personality. This provides an important complement to our theme. Among the factors that influence the progress of psychoanalytic treatment and add difficulties as well as resistance, one must take into account not only the nature of the patient's ego, but also the individuality of the psychoanalyst. It cannot be denied that psychoanalysts have not invariably reached in their own personalities the level of psychic normality to which they wish to educate their patients. The enemies of psychoanalysis frequently point to this fact with derision and use it as an argument to demonstrate the uselessness of psychoanalytic techniques. We could dismiss this criticism as making unjustifiable demands. Psychoanalysts are people who have learned to practice a peculiar art. Besides this, they must be allowed to be human beings like others. After all, no one maintains that a doctor is incapable of treating internal diseases if his own internal organs are not healthy. On the contrary, it can be argued that there are certain advantages to a man threatened by tuberculosis specializing in the treatment of people suffering from this disease. But the cases are not identical. As long as he is capable of working, a doctor suffering from lung or heart disease is not prevented from diagnosing and treating internal illnesses, while the special conditions of psychoanalytic work mean that the analyst's own defects interfere with his correct establishment of the state of affairs in his patient and prevent him from reacting effectively. Therefore, it is reasonable to expect from a psychoanalyst, as part of his qualifications, a considerable degree of normality and mental health. In addition, he must possess some kind of superiority, so that in certain analytic situations he can act as a model for his patient and in others as a teacher. And, finally, we must not forget that the psychoanalytic relationship is based on a love of truth, that is, on the recognition of reality, and that this excludes any kind of imposture or deception. Let us pause here for a moment to assure the psychoanalyst that he has our sincere sympathy for the exacting demands he has to meet in carrying out his activities. It seems almost as if the psychoanalyst was the third of those professions impossible in which you are sure beforehand that the results will be unsatisfactory. The other two, known for much longer, are education and government. Obviously, we cannot ask that the one who wants to be a psychoanalyst be a perfect being before undertaking the analysis, in other words, that only people of high and rare perfection have access to the profession. But where and how will the poor devil acquire the ideal qualifications that he will need in his profession? The answer is, in a didactic psychoanalysis, with which he begins his preparation for his future activities. For practical reasons this analysis can only be brief and incomplete. Your main goal is to train your teacher to judge whether the candidate can be accepted for a later showdown. It will have served its purpose if it gives the beginner a firm conviction of the existence of the unconscious, if it enables him, when repressed material emerges, to perceive in himself things that would otherwise be incredible to him, and if it shows him a first glimpse of the technique that has proven to be the only effective one in analytical work. This alone will not suffice for your instruction, but we count on the fact that the stimuli that he has received in his own analysis will not cease when he finishes, and that the remodeling processes will continue spontaneously in the analyzed subject, who will make use of all subsequent experiences in this newly acquired sense. In reality, this happens, and as long as it happens, it qualifies the analyzed subject to be, in turn, a psychoanalyst. Unfortunately, something else is also happening. If we try to describe it, we can only do so starting from impressions. Hostility, on the one hand, and bias, on the other, create an unfavorable atmosphere for objective investigation. It seems that a number of psychoanalysts learn to use defensive mechanisms that allow them to deflect the implications and demands of analysis away from themselves, probably towards other people, so that they remain as they are and can escape the critical and corrective influence of the analysis. Psychoanalysis. This can justify the words of the author, who warns us that when a man is invested with power it is difficult for him not to abuse it. Sometimes, if we try to understand this, we are led to draw an unpleasant analogy with the effect of X-rays on people who handle them without taking precautions. It would not be surprising if the effect of a constant preoccupation with all the repressed material fighting for its freedom in the human mind began to stir in the psychoanalyst along with the instinctual demands, which he is otherwise capable of keeping repressed. These two are dangers of psychoanalysis, although they threaten not the passive but the active element in the analytic situation, and we should not neglect dealing with them. There is no question about how we should do it. Every analyst should periodically, at intervals of about 5 years, undergo a new analysis without feeling ashamed of taking this step. This would then mean that not only the analysis, treatment of patients, but his own psychoanalysis, would be transformed from a finishable task into an endless task. Here, however, we must guard against a misunderstanding. I do not mean that analysis is something that never ends. Whichever position an analysis takes is a matter of practice. Every experienced psychoanalyst will remember a number of cases in which his patient has been given a final rebus bene gestis farewell. In the cases known as character analysis there is much less discrepancy between theory and practice. Here it is not easy to foresee a natural ending, even if exaggerated expectations are avoided and psychoanalysis is not given an excessive task. Our aspiration will not be to erase all peculiarities of individual character in favor of a schematic normality or demand that the person who has been completely psychoanalyzed not feel passions or present internal conflicts. The role of psychoanalysis is to achieve the best possible psychological conditions for the functions of the ego. With this he has fulfilled his task. In both therapeutic and character psychoanalysis we perceive that two themes present themselves with special prominence and provide the analyst with an inordinate amount of work. It is immediately apparent that a general principle is at work here. The two themes are linked to the distance between the sexes. One is characteristic of males, the other, of women. Despite the differences in their content, there is a clear correspondence between them. Something that the two sexes have in common has been forced, by the difference between the sexes, to express itself in different ways. The two themes, which correspond, are, in women, penis envy, a positive aspiration to possess a masculine genital organ - and in men, the fight against their passive or feminine attitude towards another man. What was common to the two themes was isolated at an early time from the nomenclature of psychoanalysis as an attitude towards the castration complex. Alfred Adler later introduced the term male protest into common parlance. It fits perfectly in the case of men, but I think that from the beginning repudiation of femininity would have been the correct description of this remarkable fact in the psychic life of human beings. In trying to introduce this factor into the structure of our theory, we must not overlook the fact that by its very nature it cannot occupy the same position in the two sexes. In men, the aspiration to masculinity is, from the beginning, in tune with the self. The passive attitude, since it presupposes an acceptance of castration, is energetically repressed, and frequently its presence is only revealed by excessive hypercompensation. In females, too, the aspiration to masculinity becomes syntonic with the ego at a certain period, that is, in the phallic phase, before the evolution of femininity has begun. But then succumb to the stormy processes of repression, the success of which, as has been demonstrated so many times, determines the achievement of a woman's femininity. Much depends on a sufficient amount of his masculinity escaping repression and exerting a permanent influence on his character. Normally large portions of the complex are transformed and contribute to the formation of her femininity. The appeased desire for a penis is destined to become the desire for a baby and for a husband who owns a penis. It is strange, however, how often we find that the desire for masculinity has been retained in the unconscious and from its repressed state exerts a disturbing influence. As is seen from what I have said, in both cases it is the attitude appropriate to the opposite sex that has succumbed to repression. I have already pointed out elsewhere that it was Wilhelm Fliess who drew my attention to this point. Fliess was inclined to regard the antithesis between the sexes as the true cause, the driving force and the primeval motive of repression. I am only repeating what I said then when expressing my disagreement with his opinion, when I refused to sexualize the repression in this way, that is, to explain it on biological grounds instead of purely psychological ones. The great importance of these two themes, in women the desire for a penis and in men the fight against passivity, did not escape Ferenczi. In the work read by him in 1927, he considered it a requirement for all successful psychoanalysis that these two complexes had been dominated. I would like to add that, from my own experience, I think that by asking this, I was asking too much. At no time in psychoanalytic work do you suffer more from an oppressive feeling that repeated efforts have been in vain and you suspect that you have been preaching in the desert than when trying to persuade a woman to give up her desire for a penis because it is unrealizable, or when trying to convince a man that a passive attitude towards men does not always mean castration and is indispensable in many relationships in life. The rebellious hypercompensation of the male produces one of the strongest resistances to transference. He refuses to submit to a surrogate parent or feel indebted to him for anything and therefore refuses to accept his healing by the doctor. A similar transference cannot be caused by a woman's desire for a penis, but it is in her the source of severe episodes of depression due to an internal conviction that the analysis will be of no use and that nothing can be done to help her. And we have to accept that she is right when we know that her strongest motive for the treatment was the hope that, after all, she could still obtain a male organ, the absence of which was so painful for her. But we also learn from this that it is not important how the resistance appears, whether as a transference or not. The decisive thing remains that the resistance prevents any change from appearing, that everything continues as it was before. We often have the impression that with the desire for a penis and the masculine protest we have penetrated through all the psychological layers and have reached the living rock, and that therefore our activities have come to an end. This is probably true, since for the psychic field the biological territory actually plays the part of the underlying living rock. The repudiation of femininity may be nothing more than a biological fact, a part of the great enigma of sexuality. It would be difficult to say if and when we have succeeded in mastering this factor in a psychoanalytic treatment. We can only console ourselves with the certainty that we have given the analyzed person all the necessary encouragement to re-examine and modify his attitude towards him. End. Terminable and interminable analysis. Sigmund Freud.